They called her a shadow long before anyone dared speak her name. Savannah in 1815 lay draped in Spanish moss, fog curling over cobblestones and mud paths like whispers of lost souls. Lanterns sputtered against the damp, and the river, dark and slow, carried secrets in its currents. She walked among the quarters, body bent under weight unseen, eyes downcast, and yet the people spoke of her in hushes. Her name was Amara, though few dared whisper it aloud. She had borne 5 children, each stolen from her arms before she could taste their warmth. Not once did she cradle a child of her own. Her womb had become a vessel of commerce, her flesh a currency for those with wealth and greed. In the quiet corners of Savannah, they whispered that her name had already been forgotten, replaced with something colder, something that carried both fear and sorrow. Amara moved slowly through the day, carrying water, carrying firewood, bending under loads others would balk at, yet never a word escaped her lips. The children of the quarters kept their distance, daring one another to touch the shadow she cast, to see if it might burn them. The women watched her, bowed heads betraying their secret awe, recognizing a grief too vast to name. Every movement, every glance downward, every pause at the doorway whispered a story of absence, of lives she had made and lost before even their first cry reached her ears. At night, when the fireflies flickered and the fog thickened, Amara would step outside and tilt her head to the stars. Her hands clenched so tightly her nails carved crescents into her palms. She whispered names into the night, names that were never spoken aloud anywhere else, names of children carried to distant lands, never to return. And still, the people of Savannah spoke of her in whispers, half in fear, half in wonder, unsure whether she was cursed or blessed, human or spirit. The river murmured to itself as it passed beneath the bridges, and the moss swayed as though listening. Shadows lengthened in her wake, and even the wind seemed to bend around her, as if it feared disturbing the story she carried with her. Some of the older women said she had always been this way, that sorrow had chosen Amara before she was even born, shaping her life into a vessel of grief, a crucible of pain that no coin, no kindness could ever relieve. Yet in that weight, there was also a strange dignity. Amara bore her labor and loss silently, with the patience of someone who had nothing left to lose but the memory of what had been stolen. And so the legend began, before any coin was exchanged, before any child was taken, before the lullaby even reached its first note. They did not speak her name lightly. They did not know what to call her. And perhaps that was the beginning of her immortality. A shadow moves silently, a story told in whispers, and legends are born not when people look at you, but when they cannot look away. The fog swallowed Amara's silhouette as she walked back to her cabin, and the lanterns flickered low. Somewhere a cicada chirped, a dog barked, and the river kept moving, carrying secrets downstream. But the shadow remained, patient, waiting, as if she already knew that life would take from her 5 times, and that the story of her grief would not end in silence. The cabin smelled of sweat, with smoke, and something heavier, fear compressed into the corners like a living thing. Amara lay on the rough boards, her body curled over in labor, her breath shallow and jagged, each one a prayer she did not dare voice. The fire guttered in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across the walls, shadows that seemed to mock her pain. Her hands pressed against the splintered floor, fingers digging grooves that would never heal, while outside, the world went on, indifferent to the agony contained within this tiny space. The master's boots thudded along the outside path, deliberate, measured. He did not enter, yet his presence hung heavier than any lash. He had no interest in her cries or her struggle. He cared only for the outcome, the child that would soon be lifted from her arms, wrapped in cloth and carried away to strangers. To him, Amara was not a mother, not a woman, but a womb, a vessel producing currency, a life to be traded. The weight of his gaze pressed down, unseen yet suffocating, as if the walls themselves leaned inward to witness every contraction, every scream, every drop of blood shed in silence. The women in the cabin moved quietly around her, their eyes wide with fear and sorrow. None spoke, none offered comfort that could reach her anyway. They had seen this ritual too many times, the bending, the breaking, the relinquishing of what should have been her own. One woman brushed Amara's damp hair from her forehead, fingers trembling. The touch was fleeting, almost apologetic, as if to remind the world that kindness existed only in small, fleeting gestures. Amara's eyes met hers briefly, a flicker of recognition, a shared understanding of injustice that needed no words. Then the moment passed, and labor claimed her again, pulling her under with its relentless tide. The cabin was silent except for her cries and the occasional creak of the boards. Outside, the wind shifted in the Spanish moss, carrying the smell of river mud and distant salt. It whispered through the gaps in the walls, brushing against her skin like a ghostly hand. The world beyond this room did not know of her suffering. It did not care, and in that knowledge, her despair deepened, for she understood fully that her labor was not an offering to life, but a toll paid to cruelty. The fire's glow flickered over the knife and rope left in the corner, tools for other chores, other punishments, unconnected to this labor, yet silently promising consequence. Amara gritted her teeth and drew in another breath. Each contraction pulled her further from herself, further from any fleeting hope that she might hold this child, name it, breathe into its cheeks. Already, the future was stolen from her, as it had been 5 times before. And still, amid the pain, a strange resilience formed. Her eyes, wet and bloodshot, stared into the hearth. Each cry was a declaration that she existed, that her grief mattered even if no one would witness it fully. She became a figure larger than the cabin, larger than the chains that restrained her. Her body, though beaten and exhausted, carried an invisible strength, the endurance of one who has known relentless loss yet refuses to vanish entirely. Outside, the master's shadow lingered at the doorway. He would not enter, would not acknowledge her suffering. His world measured only profit. And yet, even in his absence, he loomed over her, an ever-present weight, a reminder that her life, her labor, her children, belonged not to her, but to a system built on exploitation. Amara's body shook with the rhythm of contraction and release, pain and endurance. The room became a vessel of sweat, of tears, of blood, of the quiet dignity of a woman forced into submission yet refusing to surrender fully. And in the shadows, the world waited, unaware that within this small, wooden cabin, something far larger than any master or buyer was being forged. A spirit tempered in suffering, a heart hardened and prepared for the reckonings yet to come. The child was gone before Amara could even draw a breath of hope. The moment it slipped from her body, the cradle that should have held warmth and life remained empty. Her arms reached out, trembling, fingers curling in air as if she could grasp existence itself. The women who had witnessed her labor averted their eyes, yet the weight of their gaze was heavy, carrying the unspoken recognition of her loss. 5 times she had bled, 5 times she had labored, and 5 times her arms had been left vacant, the echo of a child's cry swallowed by walls that had grown too familiar with grief. Amara sat on the splintered floor, her chest heaving, sweat mixing with the blood that clung stubbornly to her skin. The room was silent except for the faint crackle of the dying fire. Outside, the wind swirled the moss, carrying whispers of distant waters and rustling leaves. Even nature seemed to mourn with her, yet offered no solace. Her womb had been a vessel, but the life it produced belonged to others, to strangers in fine coats and foreign voices who had no concept of love, only acquisition. The cabin felt smaller with each loss. Every wall, every beam, seemed to lean inward, pressing her back into the floor. Her back ached, her fingers throbbed, and yet the deeper wound was within, a hollow carved in the center of her being that no comfort could fill. The women around her dared not speak. Their eyes, wide and sorrowful, told the stories their lips could not. One dared to brush Amara's hair from her face, Another offered a hand, trembling with empathy, but even these gestures were insufficient against the enormity of her grief. Amara pressed her hands against her face, hiding the tears she did not want to show, the sobs she did not want heard. Each child taken from her arms was a betrayal etched into the fibers of her existence. 5 lives stolen before they could know her, before they could know warmth, before they could even feel the touch of their own mother. And still, she endured, though the endurance was no comfort. It was survival. Survival was a burden heavier than any chain, heavier than any whip, heavier than the silence that followed her cries. Outside, the master made his rounds, unconcerned with the tiny tragedies unfolding in his cabin. He measured only profit, only gain, only what the world could take from Amara without consequence. She was invisible to him except as a producer of currency, and so the world continued, indifferent to the human suffering it had cultivated. The children were already wrapped, already carried off into foreign arms, destined for lives shaped by wealth and convenience, untouched by the blood, sweat, and love that had brought them into being. And yet, even in her brokenness, Amara's presence was formidable. The women whispered that there was a fire within her, a quiet defiance that no transaction could erase. She did not curse, she did not strike, she did not beg. She simply held herself upright in the shadow of her loss, a monument to endurance, a figure both pitied and revered. Her silence spoke louder than words ever could. As the cabin emptied of her children and the door closed behind the buyers, a chill settled over the floorboards. The fire sputtered, and Amara's shadow stretched long and thin across the walls, a reminder of what was taken and what remained. She remained, steadfast in grief, a vessel emptied yet unbroken. Her eyes lifted to the ceiling, to the dark beams above, as though seeking the stars through cracks in the roof. And in that gaze, in that stillness, a seed was planted, a quiet, smoldering determination that one day the ledger of cruelty might be balanced, and the world would reckon with the cost of what it had taken from her. By candlelight, the cabin transformed into a theater of commerce. Outside, Savannah's streets were cloaked in fog, but inside, the shadows of wealth and greed loomed larger than the walls themselves. The British buyers arrived in fine coats, boots polished to a gloss that reflected the flickering firelight. Their voices were clipped, foreign, precise, a language of civility masking the barter of lives. They did not see Amara. She was there, yet invisible, a figure draped in the weight of her sorrow, her body bearing the marks of labor and grief. The children, swaddled and quiet, were presented like merchandise, their cries muted beneath layers of cloth and expectation. The buyers examined them clinically, speaking of charity to those who could not have children, yet the transactions carried no warmth. Coins clinked against counters. Hands exchanged bills. Contracts were drawn in ink as cold and permanent as the decision to steal her motherhood. Every exchange took place over her head. Every smile they offered a reminder of how little they valued the life behind the swaddling. Amara's eyes followed each child as it was lifted from the cabin floor. The infant's tiny fingers curled in reflex, grasping nothing, grasping no mother. She wanted to scream, to tear them from the hands of strangers, to reclaim what had been carved from her own flesh and blood. But she remained silent, for silence had become her refuge, her weapon, and her cloak. Her lips pressed tight, her chest heaved under the weight of what she could not prevent. The world around her moved, cheerful, indifferent, yet every fiber of her being screamed at the injustice unfolding before her eyes. One of the buyers, tall, red-faced, polite in tone, commented on the children's good health and temperament. Another nodded, inspecting the limbs and fingers with clinical detachment. They spoke of heredity, of market value, of how these children would fit into lives not their own. Amara's heart clenched at every word, each syllable a hammer, striking the hollowed-out center of her existence. The cabin itself seemed to lean closer to her, the rough boards pressing in, walls shrinking as though to witness her helplessness. The women who had tended to her labor stood in corners, shadows themselves, their hands folded, eyes downcast. Some dared a glance at Amara, offering a small flicker of acknowledgement. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and continued to watch as the children were lifted, carried, and handed over. Coins exchanged hands, seals pressed, and doors closed behind departing footsteps. She remained, body trembling, spine rigid, absorbing every act as though storing it, filing it away, not for revenge yet, but for the day when the ledger might be balanced. And though they did not see her, Amara saw everything. The glint of silver, the precise movement of hands, the casual way life was measured as currency. Her grief hardened into something colder, a steel embedded in sorrow. She whispered nothing, but inside, a song of reckoning began, a slow, steady rhythm, like the pulse of the river outside, constant and unyielding. Each transaction, each stolen child, each indifferent glance, fed a fire no coin could extinguish. As the night drew on and the buyers departed, the cabin fell into silence again. The fire guttered low, smoke curling into the rafters. Amara remained, seated among the boards still warm from labor, her shadow stretching across the floor as if to claim the space for herself. Outside, Savannah's fog pressed close, carrying the distant sound of river and wind. Inside, the weight of injustice pressed equally heavy, but within that weight, a seed of defiance had taken root, a quiet, smoldering knowledge that the world could not always take without consequence. Amara became more than a woman. She became a whisper, a shadow moving through the quarters where children dared not tread. Mothers lowered their eyes as she passed, fearing the weight she carried. Yet some secretly revered her, sensing in her silence a story too vast to speak aloud. Her name existed only in fleeting murmurs. Amara, the mother of none. But more often, she was not named at all. She was legend, rumor, sorrow walking with the dignity of someone who had endured everything and given nothing to the world that demanded it. Children avoided her shadow. They darted past her, hands clutching each other, eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear. She had held none of them, yet she carried within her the memory of 5 stolen lives, each one a spark of what could have been. The women of the quarters exchanged glances when she passed, and though their lips were sealed, their eyes told tales of understanding. Amara's grief was too immense for words. It was a weight they recognized in themselves, a shared knowledge of injustice carved into flesh and bone. At night, she stepped outside, head tilted to the stars. Her palms bore crescent-shaped scars from nails dug in, marks left from hours of silent pleading for children who would never know her touch. She whispered names into the wind, names carried far away into lands she would never see. The wind took her words, curling them into the Spanish moss, slipping them into the river, letting her sorrow drift beyond the boundaries of human sight. And yet, she wondered if any of them, her children, looked at the same stars, sensing, somehow, that a mother's blood ran through their veins. Amara's hands, rough from labor and work, trembled as she traced patterns in the dirt. Each mark was a prayer, a testament, a small rebellion against the injustice that had marked her life. She spoke to no one, yet her presence spoke volumes. Some whispered that she was cursed, others called her a saint. Children told stories in hushed tones, embellishing her shadow, adding shapes to it, giving it life beyond her own. The quarters became a place where her legend lived. Even as her real self remained bound by chains unseen, her flesh and spirit tethered to lives she had never been allowed to hold. Even in the quiet moments, when no one watched, Amara's eyes held fire. The fire of grief, yes, but also of endurance. She had survived 5 losses, 5 betrayals, 5 instances of the world taking what she loved most. And yet, there was a resolve now, subtle but unyielding, growing beneath the sorrow. It whispered to her as clearly as the river whispered to the moss, The world had taken from her, but it had not yet broken her. The night deepened and the fog thickened, curling around the cabins, wrapping the quarters in a soft, suffocating embrace. Amara stared upward, listening to the wind and the river, hearing the rustle of leaves as if they carried messages from lands she would never see. She dug her nails once more into her palms, letting the pain anchor her to reality, to the knowledge that she had endured, that she had survived, that she still had breath in her body while the world had claimed her children. And somewhere, in the shadowed corners of Savannah, rumors began to swirl. They said she was neither wholly human nor spirit, that she spoke to the river and the wind, that she carried grief and fire in equal measure. They said she would not rest, that the world had not yet seen the extent of her endurance. She remained unspoken, unnamed, unclaimed, but her legend, fragile yet powerful, stretched longer and wider than anyone could measure. After her fifth birth, something within Amara finally broke. Not with screams, not with pleading, not with the sharp bite of despair outwardly expressed. Instead, she collapsed into herself, a quiet implosion, a hollowing that stretched her soul thin. The cabin, thick with the scent of sweat and blood, seemed to pause around her, as if holding its breath in reverence or horror. Her body trembled, but her voice, soft and cracked, began to rise. A lullaby, once meant for the children she had briefly held, now a song to absence itself, escaped her lips. The notes wavered in the candlelight, fragile yet haunting. It carried through the thin wooden walls, over the dirt paths, and into the foggy night. Even the overseer, his lantern swinging with lazy, negligent steps, paused in his patrol. His shadow fell across the cabin floor, but his eyes fell too, listening to the sound of a woman who had given everything and kept nothing. Her song was both mourning and accusation, a measure of injustice that no whip, no chain, no coin could ever calculate. Amara's hands, trembling but precise, traced invisible patterns in the air. She did not reach for anything tangible. There was nothing left to touch, but her voice carried weight as though the room itself were her child. Each note was a pulse of grief, a heartbeat of endurance, a claim to the humanity the world had denied her. She closed her eyes, letting the lullaby hold her upright, letting it be the scaffold that supported the pieces of herself that the world had shattered. The women of the quarters pressed against their own doors and windows, hearing the melody wind through the night. Some dared a single tear, some turned their faces away. They knew, they knew, that this was no ordinary lullaby. It was the voice of life itself, spoken from a womb that had been repeatedly stolen, from a body that had been forced to give without receiving, from a soul that had endured the impossible. The notes echoed beyond reason, carrying the invisible weight of 5 lost children, of 5 stolen futures, of a mother denied her own. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the Spanish moss with a sound almost like whispers, almost like voices responding to her song. The river churned softly in the distance, as if acknowledging, as if remembering. Shadows stretched long across the quarters, bending toward the cabin, drawn to the echo of a grief so profound it altered the night itself. Amara's song did not falter. It did not apologize. It did not plead. It simply existed, and in that existence, it became something sacred, something untouchable. Even a master, drunk and oblivious in his quarters, heard faintly the persistence of that haunting melody. He did not understand it, could not measure it, could not stop it. For a moment, power faltered, respect, if such a word could exist here, slipped through the cracks of his control. And Amara, bent and bleeding, exhausted yet indomitable, sang for the air itself, for the shadows, for the children she could not hold, for the quiet defiance that no chain could contain. When the lullaby finally faded, the cabin was still. The fire sputtered low, smoke curling into the rafters like ghosts. Amara lay back, hollowed yet not broken, exhausted yet vigilant. She had given her voice to the world, had poured grief and love into it, and the world had no choice but to bear witness, if only in silence. The song lingered in the air, in the shadows, in the wind, a faint echo of what had been stolen and what had survived. And somewhere, beyond the river and the moss, rumors began to take root. They whispered that her song would never truly end, that it would rise again, carrying with it the weight of all she had lost, the fire of her endurance, and the quiet, smoldering promise that injustice had not yet had the final word. Whispers spread through Savannah like smoke carried on the wind. Amara's name, or the absence of it, slithered through the quarters, spoken softly by children who had never known her touch, by women who recognized grief in their own bones, by men who avoided her shadow for reasons they could not name. Some said her children would rise one day, strangers bound by blood they did not understand, their lives unknowingly tied to hers. Others claimed her tears had poisoned the earth itself, leaving barren patches where the soil refused to yield. Rumors carried weight heavier than any chain, heavier than any punishment. They were the first seeds of legend. By the river, people said they saw her at night, standing in the mist, whispering to unseen infants floating in the dark waters. Her silhouette shifted in the moonlight, elongated and spectral, a shadow moving between life and story, between grief and vengeance. The women in the quarters spoke of her in hushed tones. Cursed saint, witch, mother of none, shadow of all. Children dared each other to approach the edge of her world, yet none did. Fear and fascination mingled like smoke above the fires of Savannah, both impossible to separate. Her presence became myth long before any action confirmed it. The moss seemed to part in her wake, the wind to carry her intent, and the river murmured secrets no human ear could fully grasp. She moved silently through the quarters, carrying grief and endurance alike, and every gesture became symbolic, a nod to those who understood, a warning to those who did not. Some said she spoke to the shadows, bargaining with them, shaping them into protectors or witnesses. Others swore they saw sparks of anger flicker in her eyes, fire that no candle could contain. Amara's suffering, like embers buried in ash, was invisible yet persistent. Even a master could sense it, though he did not name it, could not measure it, could not fully comprehend it. He saw her silhouette, the quiet endurance, the absence of tears at times when they should have been present, and it unnerved him. Profit had always been his only concern, yet here was a woman whose grief carried weight beyond gold, whose silence threatened more than a complaint could. Some of the older women said that Savannah itself had changed since Amara arrived, as if her sorrow, her endurance, and her silent fury had been absorbed into the soil, the river, and the moss. Even the fog seemed to hesitate where she passed, thickening, curling around her like a shroud, carrying rumors further than lips or letters ever could. The quarters were alive with story, whispered accounts of grief, endurance, and small acts of quiet defiance that no coin could account for. Each tale added to the weight of her legend, each retelling a spark that would eventually ignite into something unstoppable. And yet, amid the whispers, a subtle tension grew, one not yet realized by those who spoke in fear and fascination. Beneath the sorrow, beneath the myth, beneath the shadow of stolen children, there existed a quiet, smoldering promise. Something waiting, watching, planning. Amara carried it within her, a patient ember, invisible yet alive, a reckoning measured not in months or years, but in the exact moment when injustice would finally meet consequence. By the edges of Savannah, where the river reflected the fog and the trees bent toward the water, the story of Amara deepened. Not just a woman, not just a mother of none, but a force waiting, gathering, preparing. The quarters spoke of her in fragments, half-truths, embellishments. And with every whisper, every rumor, the weight of anticipation grew. Something was coming. The legend was no longer just sorrow. It was a warning, a flicker of fire beneath ash, a shadow pregnant with consequence. And as the night deepened, The fog thickened, and the quartered fires guttered low. The people of Savannah felt, without fully knowing why, that Amara's story had yet to reach its crescendo. Somewhere in the silence between whispers, a reckoning stirred, waiting patiently for the moment it would no longer be deferred. The mist hung low over Savannah, thick as grief itself, curling around cabins and cobblestones, shrouding the river in silvered mystery. Amara moved through it like a shadow, fully realized, her steps silent but purposeful. The whispers that had spread through the quarters had reached their apex. Rumors of her endurance, of her sorrow, of her silent fury, but no one yet knew the measure of her resolve. Tonight, the story would change. Tonight, she would no longer only endure. She would claim justice in her own hands. The master's house loomed at the end of a crooked path, lanterns flickering weakly against the fog. Inside, he sat in his chair, coins counting and contracts spread before him, oblivious to the presence of the shadow that had haunted his quarters, his profits, his conscience. He had taken from her 5 times, 5 children, 5 pieces of her life, 5 remnants of her heart. And now, in the stillness of the night, Amara entered, silent as ash drifting on the wind. Her body bore the marks of labor, of grief, of endurance, but her eyes burned with a fire they had never seen, a fire sharpened by loss and patience. He did not hear her approach. He did not feel her shadow stretch over him, a chill creeping into the room colder than any winter wind. And when he finally looked up, it was too late. Amara's hands, once folded in silent suffering, now gripped the tools of her vengeance. Not with haste, not with frenzy, but with deliberate, calm precision. Each strike was measured, a pulse of justice delivered from the womb that had produced life only to see it stolen. The room echoed with the finality of her act, a sound that was at once terrifying and cathartic, a symphony of reckoning long overdue. Outside, the fog thickened, as if nature itself bent to witness the moment. The river murmured against the banks, the moss swayed in hushed reverence, and the quartered fires flickered low, casting shadows that seemed to dance in acknowledgment. Amara stood over the master, her chest heaving, hands slick with the truth of the world she had long carried alone. He was gone, and yet the air still trembled with the weight of what had been. This was no mindless act of revenge. It was a story told in flesh and consequence, a ledger balanced at last, a shadow reclaiming what was never meant to be taken. The quarters awoke slowly to the echoes. Windows cracked open, doors creaked, lanterns trembled in the hands of those who had long whispered her legend. Some dared to see, some looked away, but all felt the shift. The legend of Amara had transformed from sorrowful whisper to undeniable force. Her grief was no longer contained in cabins and contracts. It flowed like the river, inescapable, unstoppable, marking the night with the memory of all she had lost and all she had endured. And yet, even in triumph, she did not celebrate. Her children were still far, scattered like seeds in foreign winds, her body still marked with the scars of labor and suffering. But the ledger was balanced, the weight of injustice met with consequence. She walked from the master's house into the fog, her shadow stretching long, merging with the mist. She became both woman and legend, mother and avenger, sorrow and fire entwined. The people of Savannah would speak of her not as Amara, not as a slave, not as a mother denied, but as a force, a warning, a story whispered through generations. They would tell of the shadow that moved in the fog, of the river that carried grief and vengeance alike, of the woman whose patience had forged justice. Her children, wherever they might be, would inherit a legacy not just of blood, but of a mother who would not yield to cruelty. And so, the final whisper drifted across Savannah. 5 times she gave life. 5 times life was stolen. And 5 times, the world learned that her shadow could not be chained. The mist swallowed her silhouette. The river murmured. The fire died low in the cabins. But somewhere, in the hush between whispers, The legend of Amara waited, restless, eternal, and undefeated.